from a spiritual perspective, we see unexpected grace, the invited people, those who will be in eternity with God, include many that we'd never imagine might be invited. In our parable, it's the poor, the maimed, the blind, and the lame. The Pharisees would not have been able to get their head around that those would be people that would be at the banquet. They would think they would because they would have earned it because of their self-righteousness. No, but we see, as we look at this parable, we see that no, it's the people that are spiritually poor, maimed, blind, lame, not physically, but spiritually, that are going to be invited, even though, spiritually speaking, they bring nothing to the table. And that's why I'm talking here about unexpected grace we see in this parable. And we see it in lots of places throughout Scripture. In the Old Testament, there's the great story in 2 Samuel 4 about Mephibosheth. And I had to pronounce that carefully because that is a difficult name. Mephibosheth, he is the son of Jonathan. David has ascended to be king. And we read in 2 Samuel that Mephibosheth, as a baby, was dropped by a caretaker, and in that moment became physically disabled in both feet and legs, and physically had nothing to warrant a seat at the king's table. But because of David's unexpected grace that he showed to Mephibosheth, even though there was nothing Mephibosheth did to earn a seat at the king's table, there's nothing he could have done, in grace and kindness, David said, "Come, sit at my banquet," as a picture of what God would do for us. In the New Testament, we see the thief on the cross. In January, Brett is going to be speaking a whole sermon on the thief on the cross. But briefly here, the thief on the cross has nothing spiritually to offer Jesus. He responds to Jesus in faith, and Jesus says, "Truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." He had nothing to bring to the table spiritually. One of my favorite stories is in John chapter 4. It's a true story, not a parable, of the woman at the well. For those of you that don't remember that story, Jesus found his way to a well in Samaria, a place where Jews were typically not welcome. And he's by himself at a well, and a woman comes up to draw water in the middle of a hot day. She's by herself. Usually the people would have come to the well in the morning when it was cool, but she comes by herself because she knows she's been rejected by everybody. And she shows up at the well. She sees a man there. There's no chance they would have a conversation, because a man and a woman that weren't related would not have had a conversation back in those days. And especially when she recognizes that he's Jewish, she's a Samaritan. The Jews and the Samaritans pretty much hated each other, constant tension. There's no chance they would have a conversation. And yet Jesus engages kindly, without judging, despite the fact that he knows that she has a past. She's been married 5 times, and she's now living with a different man that she's not married to. Jesus knows that, and he is not there to condemn. He offers her living water. She would have never expected that he would have a conversation with her. No one would have ever expected in that time that Jesus would have a conversation with her, and yet she becomes the first person to whom he reveals himself publicly as the Messiah. The Eastern Orthodox Church tradition tells us her name was Fotina, and she becomes an evangelist that tells everybody about this man that knew everything she'd ever done. This is an amazing picture of unexpected grace. You would not expect her to have met the Messiah that day. You would not have expected the thief on the cross to have met the Messiah while on the cross, that would have been the best day of his life. And we read these stories, we read our parable, and when we think about it, we're left to realize that I am Mephibosheth. Spiritually speaking, I am the poor, the maimed, the blind. I am the thief on the cross. Spiritually speaking, I am the woman at the well. I have nothing to offer God that would warrant a place at his banquet. Nothing to offer. When I look at who God is and I look at who I am and understand my sinfulness, how far I am from God in the way I act, think, motivated, all sorts of things, I am overwhelmed by God's unexpected grace toward me.